The story of Gallipoli is a story of military disaster. The Gallipoli campaign led to the deaths of over 200,000 Allied troops, resulted in Winston Churchill losing his job, and achieved almost nothing. So, why was the campaign fought? What went wrong? And who was to blame?
In early 1915, the deadlock on the Western Front was established. A war of attrition was being waged. The Central Powers were having to fight a war on two fronts, France and Britain in the west and Russia to the east. It was crucial for the Allies to maintain both of these fronts if they were to be successful. The Russians, however, were in need of help. Less wealthy than France or Britain, Russia needed supplies. And the Allies had supplies to offer. The problem, however, was how to bring them to Russia. The easiest way, in theory, would be to transport resources via ship through a stretch of water known as the Dardanelles. The Dardanelles connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, allowing the passage of goods from Europe to Russia. The problem was that this area, the Dardanelles, was under the control of Turkey, and the Turkish, also known as the Ottomans, had joined forces with the Central Powers in 1914. When the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, they made sure that the Dardanelles remained closed to the Allies. They did this by building forts along the Gallipoli coast and placing mines throughout the sea. Turkish control of the Dardanelles, therefore, was particularly frustrating for the Allies. If they could find some way of defeating the Ottomans, they could break open the sea passage to Russia and surround Germany and Austria-Hungary.
An attack on Turkey, therefore, was particularly tempting, and all that was needed was a cunning plan.
The man tasked with coming up with a cunning plan was none other than future British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. In 1911, Churchill had become First Lord of the Admiralty. This meant he was in charge of the British Navy. Churchill was not someone who lacked confidence, and he had just been put in charge of the greatest navy the world had ever seen. His plan, unsurprisingly, suffered from being over-ambitious. Churchill thought he could defeat the Turkish without even landing foot in Turkey itself. His initial idea was to use the British Navy to wipe out the coastal defences along the Gallipoli Peninsula. Once these defences, made up of forts, artillery and minefields, had been taken out, the Navy could sail up the Dardanelles to the Turkish capital. The capital, Constantinople, now modern-day Istanbul, could then be attacked from the sea and Turkey would have no choice but to surrender. What could possibly go wrong? Well, let's have a look. The first phase of the plan went reasonably well. The Navy successfully attacked the Turkish fort on the 19th of December, on the tip of the peninsula. 6 days later, the entrance to the Dardanelles appeared clear. It was here, however, where things began to go wrong. Assuming the path through the Dardanelles was now clear, the British sent 18 large battleships into the Dardanelles passage. What they discovered, however, was that the Turkish forts further up the coast were more powerful than they had expected. Mines also lay beneath the water, and these had a devastating effect. In total, 3 British ships were sunk and another 3 badly damaged, and the British Navy were forced to retreat.
The British needed a different plan of attack. If they couldn't defeat the Turkish from the sea, then they would need to engage them on land, and this resulted in Phase 2.
British soldiers were in short supply, so a force, consisting largely of troops from the British Empire, was put together. Australians, New Zealanders, French, Canadians, Indians and Irish soldiers made up an army of 70,000, and General Sir Ian Hamilton was put in charge. The plan was to transport these soldiers to several strategic points across the Gallipoli Peninsula and then land them on the beaches in smaller boats. Once arrived, they would bash through the Turkish defences and take control of the coastal forts. This, it was hoped, would allow the British Navy time to pass through the Dardanelles without a problem. Again, what could possibly go wrong? Well, let's take a look at what happened. Several landings were planned across the Gallipoli Peninsula. One section of these armies were to land on 5 separate beaches at Cape Helles on the tip of the Gallipoli Peninsula. Another force, made up of Australian and New Zealanders, would land at beaches further to the north at a place called Gaba Tepe. This force was nicknamed ANZACs, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. The invasion began on the 25th of April. 70,000 soldiers landed on the Turkish coast. Up until the Second World War, this was the largest amphibious attack in recorded history. The Turkish, however, were aware that an invasion was coming and were ready for action. On the beaches, the Allies faced fierce attacks. Only 3 of the 5 beach attacks at Cape Helles were successful. Disastrously, at the Anzac Cove, the Turkish were positioned upon cliff tops and were able to fire down at the Australian and New Zealand troops. The Allies suffered huge losses. Before long, the Allied forces at both Cape Helles and at the Anzac Cove were forced to dig themselves into trenches. The quick victory Churchill hoped for had not materialised. Instead, these soldiers were stuck in these trenches for 8 long months. And the conditions were terrible. As spring turned to summer, the Turkish heat became unbearable. An estimated 80% of the Anzac army suffered from dysentery. Eventually, a relief force of 60,000 soldiers attempted another landing in August, this time at Solva Bay. Once again, however, the attack failed to break through the Turkish defences.
The Gallipoli campaign had been fought to try and break the stalemate on the Western Front. By the middle of 1915, however, the only real question was how to get the Allied troops out of the Turkish peninsula. And ironically, this evacuation became the most successful part of the entire Gallipoli campaign.
The man responsible for leading the invasion, General Hamilton, was replaced in October. His replacement, General Monro, decided it was time to get out of Gallipoli. On the 12th of December, at night, over 80,000 soldiers were silently evacuated from their positions and taken to boats on the shore. In total, from December to the 9th of January, roughly 135,000 troops were evacuated. Amazingly, only 3 casualties were recorded.
So, a quick summary. The Gallipoli campaign had been fought to try and knock Turkey out of the war. The British, however, had underestimated Turkey's strength, and this had been shown when 3 of their ships were sunk when trying to cross through the Dardanelles passage. This had forced them to attack by land, but these land assaults on the beaches hadn't been any more successful. For 8 months, the Allied soldiers were stuck in trenches, recreating the situation on the Western Front. Conditions here were absolutely terrible and led to the deaths of thousands of soldiers. In total, an estimated 200,000 Allies died as a consequence of the Gallipoli campaign, and arguably, they had very little to show for it.
The Gallipoli campaign had failed. Winston Churchill was removed from his position as First Lord of the Admiralty. Russia hadn't received the supplies they desperately needed. Eventually, this shortage of resources would help contribute to the Russian Revolution in 1917. So was there anything positive about Gallipoli? Well, maybe a couple of things. The evacuation was undoubtedly a success, and arguably the attack on Turkey had prevented the Turkish from offering help to the Germans on the western and eastern fronts. Overall, however, this was a world away from the plan that Churchill had come up with. So, what do you think? Have a go at answering the following questions. Why was the Gallipoli campaign fought? What went wrong and why? And was Gallipoli a complete disaster?
Thanks for watching this video, hopefully you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe, and see you at the next one.